Hello and welcome to video 4 of the channel. I'm Peter Lippmann, aka Grand Patzer. Now if one wishes to improve their chess, then the first port of call has to be tactical play, improving one's vision and tactical ability. There is absolutely no point in having great positional feel if you're just going to make a simple tactical oversight and blunder the game away at some point. So as an improving player, one must develop one's tactical ability to the maximum. Now please note that throughout my video series I will be recommending an aggressive and tactical style of play. Now what better way to learn tactics by studying the games of the greatest attacking player of all time, none other than Mikhail Tal, the magician from Riga, incidentally one of my favorite players of all time. Now, the only way to win a game of chess is to attack, and if you want to learn from the best, then definitely you need to master the art of attack using the techniques and studying the games of Mikhail Tal, who was the 8th world chess champion and the greatest attacking player of all time. Now in this video and subsequent videos, you will not only learn exactly how you can follow the same techniques to develop crushing attacks in your own games, but also you'll be able to enjoy the spectacular style of Tal's games. Unlike modern professionals who are very cautious and oftentimes end their games in a draw, Mikhail Tal never hesitated to complicate the position, take on the challenge, and play risky and speculative moves. Now Tal rated initiative and attacking options extremely highly in contrast to material value. Tal was always prepared to make considerable sacrifices in order to gain attacking chances. Note the famous quote from Tal, "There are correct sacrifices, and then there are mine." Tal often had a great sense for the initiative and dynamics, and was always ready to take on static weaknesses. One of his greatest strengths was concrete calculation of lines based on intuitive evaluation. Now, in this video I'm going to show you two of Tal's games. The first one being Mikhail Tal against Alexei Sutin. Now this game was played in 1969. Okay, so in the game Tal opened with e4, in which Tal's opponent responded with c5, that's the Sicilian defense. Knight f3 was played, e6, and Tal doesn't shy away from the main lines with d4, c takes, knight takes. That's the open Sicilian, incidentally a breeding ground for tactical play. So a6 was played, that's the Taimanov variation, bishop d3, this is all theory, and now Tal's opponent played the unusual knight e7. Tal responded by developing his knight to the most aggressive and forward square possible. Knight c3, knight bc6, and knight b3. Note that the point of knight e7 was so that Tal's opponent could perhaps swap off the knight, followed by rerouting the knight on e7 to c6. However, Tal avoids exchanges, true to his style, keeps all pieces on the board to complicate the position to the maximum. So knight g6 was played, Tal continues with his development and castles, b5, and bishop e3. Note that Tal develops his bishop to the most forward square available, which is on e3. Note that it cannot go to f4, otherwise the bishop would be en prise from the knight on g6, and bishop g5 is not possible as well either, because Black would simply capture the bishop with the queen. So bishop e3 was played, following the principle of maximum activity, and after d6, f4 was played, an aggressive move. The idea is to follow up at some point with f5, opening lines and opening the f file. Tal's opponent responded by playing bishop e7, and here Tal decides to connect rooks and move his queen to the most forward available square, following the principle of maximum activity, queen h5. Note that the queen is extremely well placed on h5, and note that there is a potential pin of the f-pawn on this diagonal. Note that it is more active and more aggressive than queen f3 or queen e2, for instance. So queen h5 was played. Tal's opponent responded by playing the dubious bishop f6. Possibly Tal's opponent, Alexei Sutin, had to castle here, when for sure white definitely has a slight advantage. Perhaps rook f3 is a move here, with the idea of swinging the rook onto h3 and threatening mate on h7, in which white would have a powerful attack. Anyway, castling was better than bishop f6, which was the move played in the game. Tal responds very logically by developing his least active piece, which is the rook on a1, onto the d file, and also shadowing the queen on d8, like that. Bishop takes c3 was played. B takes. Tal's opponent responds by moving the queen away from the line of the rook. Okay. And he decides to play queen c7. Tal continued with rook d2, a good move. Note that f5 was also possible in this position, which is also an excellent move. Now the idea of rook d2 would be at some point to swing the rook from d2 to f2, followed by f5, and black would be under a lot of pressure. Okay, so rook d2 was played. Tal's opponent played knight c7. Tal decides to centralize the knight with knight d4. Note that rook f2 was also possible here, and also a good move, followed by f5. Okay, so rook df2 would also be an equally good move. Anyway, Tal centralized his knight, putting pressure on black's position. Bishop d7 was played, and now Tal pushes forward with f5, a move in accordance with the principle of maximum activity, a very logical move, pushing forward a pawn in black's territory. Okay, so f5 was played. E takes. Now the idea of e takes f5 was that after Tal captured back on f5, which is what happened in the game, perhaps black would have access to the d5 square from the knight. Okay, so e takes f5, e takes f5 was played. Obviously Tal's opponent has to move the knight, so it came to e5. And now the brilliant knight e6 was played. Note that the f-pawn is pinned, okay, so and cannot capture the knight on e6. Okay, so another benefit of the queen being on h5. Black's opponent had to take the knight, so bishop takes e6 was played, f takes, and here Tal's opponent played g6. The best move according to Stockfish is castling. Okay, after which white would still be winning. Okay, but anyway, g6 was played. And after g6, Tal plays the absolutely brilliant, shocking and stunning move. Perhaps pause the video, have a think for yourself. Tal played the brilliant queen takes e5, sacrificing the queen in order to gain an absolutely winning and overwhelming attack. Black has no choice but to take the queen. E takes f7 was played, and Tal's opponent, Alexei Sutin, decided to call it a day and resigned. Okay, now let's look at some of the candidate moves for black. Obviously, the move least resistance is king f8, because that would lead to an immediate bishop h6, check, and mate. The other move, which also offers least resistance, is king d8, when white has a large array of moves to win the game. For example, he can play f8, check, rook takes, king d7 only move, bishop f5, king c6, bishop e4, only move is knight d5, and Tal, for instance, can simply capture the knight with the rook. The idea being that after rook takes f8, white would simply retreat the rook, for instance, to d1, and that would be check and mate. Now, going back a bit, the move that offers the most resistance here is king d7, which is still completely winning for white. Note, don't fall into the trap of playing bishop takes b5 check, because after king c8, it does seem as if black escapes. So don't play bishop takes b5 check, play bishop f5 check instead, king c6 only move, bishop e4, knight d5 only move, and for instance, there are many ways to win this position. Rook takes d5 is perhaps the cleanest, with the idea again of retreating the rook, followed by checkmate. There's not much that black can do here. His position is totally hopeless, and so that was a fine win by Mikhail Tal. A brilliant queen sacrifice, demolishing his opponent in fine tactical style. So queen takes c5 here. Absolutely brilliant. Note that Tal played very logically. He developed all of his pieces onto the most forward aggressive squares. He castled. He connected rooks by playing queen h5. Another move in accordance with the principle of maximum activity, and then pushed on with f5 after bishop d7, f5, and obtained an absolutely crushing attack. The next game I'd like to show you is between Mikhail Tal and none other than the greatest positional strategic player of all time, Tigran Petrosian. Now this is a battle between two prior world chess champions, Mikhail Tal, the great tactician, against Tigran Petrosian, the great strategist. Now this time, Tal came out a shocking victor in one of Petrosian's fastest defeats. Perhaps Petrosian was not at his best, but it is enormously impressive how Tal creates and presses home his advantage. Okay, let's have a look at the game. So, in this fascinating battle, Tal opened with knight f3, in which Petrosian responded with the modern defense. True to his style, Tal decides to transpose into a king's pawn opening, which leads to more tactical and aggressive play. Note that he could have played c4, transposing into the English opening, or d4, transposing into a queen's pawn opening. So Tal opts for e4. So bishop g7 was played. Tal responds with the best move. He takes the center with d4, d6, we have a modern, and Tal responds by developing his knight to the most forward and aggressive square, and also following the principle of knights before bishops. So we transpose into a perk, knight f6 was played, Tal played bishop e2, which transposes into the classical variation, the so-called classical variation. Both sides put their king into safety, and Petrosian responded with knight c6. Now if you think about this position, Tal does remain true to his style and follows the aggressive concept of the principle of maximum activity. He pushes a pawn into the opponent's half of the board with d5 attacking the knight on c6, in which Petrosian responded with knight b8, rook e1. This is all theory. And after e5, Tal takes the pawn en passant, bishop takes, and Tal develops his last remaining piece, bishop f4. Note that bishop g5 was possible. However, it is possible that Petrosian would have perhaps posed a question to the bishop with h6, which perhaps Tal wanted to avoid, so bishop f4 was played. Petrosian responds with h6, and Tal centralizes his knight to d4 and poses a question to the bishop on e6, in which Petrosian responds by retreating the bishop because he wanted to maintain the bishop pair. So Tal continues very logically. He played queen d2, connecting rooks, and also gaining a tempo on the h6 pawn. So the h6 pawn is attacked by the queen and bishop battery, in which Petrosian responded with king h7. And now if you think about this position, I'd like you to think of all candidate moves in the opponent's half of the board. So have a think, and what would you play here if you were Tal? Now if you think about candidate moves in the opponent's half of the board, there aren't that many, actually. In fact, there's only one candidate move that would spring to mind, and it was the move that was played. It was e5, a good move by Tal, following the principle of maximum activity. de, bishop takes, and the best move in this position is rook e8, and a sample line, for instance, would be queen f4, knight c6, bishop takes, c7, queen c8, and after knight takes, bishop takes. White is a pawn up and definitely has a slight advantage. However, black does have some compensation for the pawn. Anyway, after bishop takes c5, Petrosian makes a blunder and plays knight e4 here, after which white has a clear and unmistakable advantage, in which Tal exploits to the maximum. So after knight takes e4, bishop takes e5, Tal responded with the calm and cool and quiet move, knight f3, simply attacking the bishop on e5 and also opening the d-file for the queen and potentially the rook to join in. So after bishop g7, Tal develops his last remaining piece and plays rook a d1, shadowing the queen on d8 and pinning the bishop on d7. So Petrosian responds by unpinning with queen c8, and Tal responds by activating his least active piece, perhaps the bishop on e2, and posting it onto a more aggressive and forward square, incidentally also putting annoying pressure onto this diagonal. Okay? In particular, putting pressure on the f7 point. Okay. Petrosian responded by playing bishop e8. Note that white has a really big advantage here. Now, one of the reasons for this is because the knight on b8 hasn't been developed. Petrosian's rooks aren't developed. There seems to be congestion along the 8th rank, and Tal's pieces are all developed, all on the most aggressive, on the most active squares, and Tal played the absolutely brilliant move, knight e g5, again in accordance with the principle of maximum activity. Petrosian doesn't really have much choice but to accept the sacrifice, although king h8 was still possible, after which, after queen f4, white has an overwhelming advantage. Okay, so h takes was played, and after knight takes g5, king g8, Tal responds with the cool queen f4. Now the idea of the move is very simply to transfer the queen onto h4 and deliver mate on h7. And there isn't all that much the Petrosian can do about that. Knight d7 was played, so obviously the idea of knight d7 is to develop the knight, and also to respond queen h4 with knight f6, and black is defending for the time being. So Tau responds by eliminating the defender, the brilliant rook takes d7, and after bishop takes d7, bishop takes f7, and it's mate in 14, and Petrosian decided to call it a day. Now after bishop takes d7, note that queen h4 is also a good move here, which would also win the game. Okay. Now one sample line is rook e8, the only move to prevent checkmate on h7. So there are various ways to win. One way, the cleanest, is bishop takes f7, and after king f8, bishop takes, knight h7 for instance, king g8, knight g5, and for instance after bishop f7, one sample line is rook e7, queen f5, rook takes f7, and white is completely winning and black is busted. Okay, so going back, after bishop takes d7, queen h4 was also winning. Okay, but after the more accurate bishop takes f7, it's mate in 14, and I will show you the mate. So rook takes f7, only move, queen takes, king h8, queen takes g6, so bishop f5 to prevent queen h7 checkmate. So white would play the following: knight f7, king g8, knight h6, king h8, knight takes f7, threatening mate on g7, queen d7, queen h5 check, king g8, knight e7, king f8, queen f3, king e8, knight c6, bishop e5, rook takes e5, queen e6, rook takes, king d7, and now queen f7, king c8, and rook e8 is checkmate. Now this was another wonderful and brilliant performance by the magician from Riga. Now in particular, I liked the way, for instance, how he opened lines in the position with e5. So that was the 13th move, e5. And this is the kind of play that all chess players can learn from. It's simple, direct, and principled, and it pushes even one of the greatest defenders of all time to his limits. Now the final combination with knight eg5 on the 19th move is clean and instructive, as Tau gives the knight to bring home the attack against Petrosian's weak points on the light squares h7, f7, and e6. Now I very much hope you enjoyed these games. They were very instructive games. Thank you very much. See you in video 5. Bye bye.